Welcome everyone to the Endless Stories channel, where you will find with us the pleasure of listening to many interesting stories. If you like today's story,
do not forget to support us with the subscription and like button.
We leave you to listen to the story.
Chapter 5: The Great Confrontation.
Yassin stood in front of the mirror,
his eyes staring at the shadow that seemed to defy everything he had learned so far. The secret room was filled with mysterious energy, the air growing heavier with each passing moment. This was the final test, where he would have to face
his shadow and emerge victorious or be plunged into darkness forever. You say you're ready, the shadow said in a low but defiant voice.
But the power you seek is not yet in your hands.
All you have gained is superficial knowledge.
The true power comes from within,
from facing your worst fears. Yassin knew full well that this was not just a physical struggle.
The shadow was not an opponent he could fight with physical strength. This was an internal battle, between himself, between him and his fear and doubt.
He took a deep breath, remembering his grandmother's words.
The balance between you and your shadow is key. If you allow fear to take over, you will be a prisoner of that shadow forever. I am not afraid of you anymore,
Yassin shouted, his eyes glowing with a new sense of confidence.
You are a part of me, yes, but you are not me. All you represent are the doubts and fears that have been creeping
into my mind since I was a child.
You were the shadow that held me back, but I will not allow you to do so anymore. The shadow smiled wickedly and began to slowly move towards Yassin.
If you think that strength lies in suppressing your shadow, then you are wrong.
True strength comes from accepting both darkness and light.
Yassin felt that his words held some truth. He did not have to fight his shadow and eliminate it completely, but rather learn to live with it and understand it as a part of himself.
This was the message he had to understand from the beginning. You are right, Yassin said quietly,
stepping back slightly, then sat on his knees in front of the mirror. I do not have to fight you.
You are part of me, and I cannot ignore you or defeat you.
What I need is to understand you, to accept that you exist, but I will be the one in control of this relationship. As Yassin said those words, the energy surrounding the room began to change.
The heavy force of darkness faded, and the atmosphere gradually began to lighten. The shadow stopped advancing and looked at Yassin with eyes full of astonishment. Do you understand now? The shadow asked, his voice no longer filled with challenge, but with question. Yes, I understand. You and I are one, but I will not let you lead me anymore. I will be the one in control.
At that moment, the mirror in front of Yassin began to glow with a soft light,
and the shadow was reflected inside it differently. It was no longer just a frightening object,
but more clearly a natural reflection of Yassin.
Their features were similar, but the big difference
was in the eyes. Yassin's eyes were full of confidence and determination,
while the shadow's eyes were calm and submissive.
Yassin reached out his hand towards the mirror,
and this time he did not feel fear or hesitation.
He touched its surface, and instead of feeling the coldness he had felt before,
the surface was warm and soft. Little by little, the shadow faded into the light, and calmness returned to the room. The mirror closed behind him,
and the mysterious aura that had surrounded it disappeared.
Yassin sat on the floor, feeling a relief he hadn't felt in a long time. He had finally succeeded. He had understood his lesson and overcome the biggest challenge of his life.
At that moment, Grandma quietly entered the room. She had been watching him the whole time, but she didn't interfere.
You did it, son.
I knew you could do it. Yassin got up from his seat, walked over to his grandma, and hugged her tightly. Yes, I did it.
But I couldn't have done it without you.
Grandma smiled and looked at the mirror again. Now that you've gotten rid of your fear, you can finally control the portal. You no longer have to fear your shadow.
But it won't disappear completely.
It will always be by your side, but you will control it.
The next day, Yassin went out with his grandma to the garden surrounding the house. The air was fresh and the sun was shining. Everything looked different.
Yassin felt lighter, more connected to the world around him. Not only had he gained control of his strength, but he also saw life from a new perspective.
Grandma, what happens now?
Will the mirror still be a part of our lives? Yassin asked as he looked up at the sky.
The mirror will still be there, but you are its protector now. You will need to watch over it, making sure that no unwanted force passes through it. But most importantly, always remember that balance is what matters. Shadow and light, power and control are all part of life.
Yassin nodded, realizing that his journey was not over yet, but it had begun in a new way. He had a new responsibility to take on, but this time he was ready for it.
Chapter 5 ends here, as Yassin succeeds in overcoming his greatest fears and controlling his power.
Weeks had passed since Yassin had successfully overcome his shadow.
His life in the village had returned to normal, but something inside him had changed forever. He was no longer the curious boy who feared the unknown, but the guardian of an ancient balance between worlds,
taking charge of the secret gate that had been protected by his family for generations.
One quiet morning, Grandma sat next to Yassin in the backyard of the house. They watched the trees sway quietly in the gentle breeze.
But in Grandma's eyes, there was a look of sadness mixed with relief.
"It's time to say goodbye, my son," Grandma said softly, as if she was afraid to break the silence of the place. Yassin looked at her in surprise.
"Goodbye? What do you mean, Grandma?"
Grandma took Yassin's hand gently and smiled tenderly.
"I have been the gatekeeper for many years, and I know that my time is coming to an end. I have done my part, and you are now the rightful heir,
the new guardian. Now you can control the gate, and I do not need to stay anymore." Hearing those words, Yassin felt a pang in his heart. Grandma was more than just a gatekeeper to him.
She was his guide, his safe haven since childhood.
He couldn't imagine his life without her. "But I can't do this alone.
What if something happens? What if I am not prepared enough?"
Yassin said anxiously, holding his grandmother's hand tightly, as if trying to keep her by his side. Grandma nodded gently. "You did what you had to do. You overcame your greatest fears and understood the lesson we've learned through generations. Balance. You've proven that you're ready, and I won't be far away. You'll always feel my presence, even if I'm not physically here."
Yassin sensed something strange in the air.
Grandma's words held a deeper meaning than they seemed. He realized that he had to accept this part of the journey, despite the sadness he felt.
"What happens now?"
Yassin asked, looking at Grandma with eyes full of sorrow. Grandma smiled again, but this time her smile was filled with peace. "You will live your life as it should be. Your life will not be confined by the gate, but you will live as an ordinary person. But when the need arises, you will be able to use your strength to protect the balance.
And the gate will always be with you as part of your soul."
Grandma slowly stood up, and Yassin turned to look at the old house behind him, the house that had been filled with secrets since his childhood.
And that now held a much deeper meaning. He looked at Grandma again, but when he turned to her, she was slowly disappearing, as if melting into thin air. "Grandma,"
Yassin called, taking a step towards her, but Grandma's calm voice answered him.
"Be strong, my son. I am proud of you." Sincerely, Grandma disappeared completely, leaving Yassin alone in the garden.
There were no tears, only a deep sense of peace and contentment. Yassin realized that this was what had to happen. Grandma knew that her role was over, and that it was time to hand over the trust. Yassin returned home,
feeling the weight of the responsibility that had been placed on his shoulders,
but also full of strength. He went up to his room and stood in front of the old mirror. His face was reflected in the mirror, but this time there was no shadow or ambiguity. He saw himself clearly, a young man full of strength and awareness. Yassin whispered to himself, "I am the guard now." Years passed, and Yassin grew up and became a mature person.
But he never forgot his experience in the old house.
He lived his life between the village and the city,
and succeeded in balancing between ordinary life and his responsibilities as a gatekeeper. That experience had made him stronger and wiser.
The old house remained abandoned, but it had not lost its charm or mystery.
Whenever Yassin returned to the village, he would visit the house
and make sure that the gate was securely closed. Nothing came out or came in without his knowledge. One day, while Yassin was walking in the village with his young son,
he stopped in front of the house and looked at it with a slight smile.
"There will come a day, my son, when you will know all about this place
But not now. You have a lot of life to live before you are ready.
He knew that his role as guardian would one day come to an end,
And that the balance he had protected would endure through the generations. But he was reassured that the secret was now in safe hands. And now we have reached the end of our story. We hope that you liked the story.
We remind you again that if you are not subscribed to the channel,
Subscribe and activate the notification bell to receive all that is new.
until we meet again in a new interesting story.